Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon and welcome. I'm Steve Corral, and I'm the Dean of the Graduate School of Management here at UC Davis. It's my pleasure to welcome you here today to this Dean's Distinguished Speaker event, and I'd also like to thank our co-hosts for this event and for their help and participation, namely the Institute for Governmental Affairs and the UC Davis Energy Institute. Please also join me in thanking our sponsor today, longtime GSM business partner, Capital Public Radio. I'd also like to welcome John Argo, who is president of the GSM Alumni Board. Special welcome to all our alumni, actually, in the audience. And also a heartfelt thank you to our generous benefactors here at the school who support us financially, hire our students, support our alumni, and give their time and expertise to the school. I'd also like to recognize members of our business partnership program, which includes many of the nation's and region's top corporations. Their generous contributions help make our MBA program excellent and world-class. Our business partners enjoy special recognition and visibility in supporting management education here at UC Davis. They also enjoy benefits such as invitation to events such as this, terrific educational and networking opportunities, student consulting assistance, recruitment opportunities, executive education, and the use of our facilities in Sacramento and our campus in the East San Francisco Bay in San Ramon, in Bishop Ranch. Let me tell you about a few of our business partners who are with us here this afternoon. That includes Capital Public Radio, the Sacramento Municipal Utility District, which most of us refer to affectionately as SMUD, First Northern Bank, Genentech, Intel, Hewlett-Packard, and Downey Brand. So you can see these are really world-class companies and organizations. And if your company is interested in becoming a business partner, of course, we're happy to talk to you further. My colleague Roberta Coleman, just walking into the room at this very moment, is in charge of that. So if you'd like to learn more about that, then you can speak to Roberta or to me. So it's my honor today to introduce our distinguished speaker, R. James Woolsey. I had the great fortune to spend time with Jim this morning to get to know him a little bit better, and let me take a few minutes now to tell you about his amazing background and career. And I'll go into a little bit of detail, in part because it's such an interesting and diverse set of accomplishments that Jim has had in his career. So let me tell you about those. So Jim was born and raised in Oklahoma, went to Stanford as an undergraduate and studied history. He then won a Rhodes Scholarship and studied at the University of Oxford and St. John's College, and then went on to Yale to get his law degree. So nowadays, Jim is a venture partner with Vantage Point Ventures of San Bruno, California. He also currently chairs the strategic advisory group of the Washington, D.C. private equity fund Paladin Capital Group, and is of counsel to the Washington, D.C. office of the Boston-based law firm Goodwin Procter. In these roles, he specializes in a range of alternative energy and security issues, an interface that he's blazed the trail in many ways, and this theme of the interface of energy and security will be his main thesis in his remarks today. Jim previously served in the U.S. government on 5 different occasions, where he held presidential appointments in 2 Republican and 2 Democratic administrations. Very well balanced, Jim. 2 Republican and 2 Democratic. Very good. Most recently as director of the Central Intelligence Agency under President Clinton. During his 12 years of government service, in addition to heading the CIA and the intelligence community, Mr. Woolsey was ambassador to the Negotiation on Conventional Armed Forces in Europe, Undersecretary of Navy, General Counsel to the U.S. Senate Committee on Armed Forces. He was also appointed by the President to serve on a part-term basis in Geneva, Switzerland, as delegate at large to the U.S.-Soviet strategic arms reduction talks and nuclear and space arms talks. As an officer in the U.S. Army, he was an advisor on the U.S. delegation to the strategic arms limitation talks in Helsinki and Vienna. From 2002 to 2008, he was the vice president and officer in the global strategic management consulting firm Booz Allen and Hamilton. He was also partner at the law firm of Shea and Gardner in Washington, and now Goodwin and Proctor, where he practiced for 22 years in the fields of civil litigation, arbitration, and mediation. He's a member of the National Commission on Energy Policy and co-chairman with former Secretary George Shultz of the Committee on the Present Danger. He's chairman of the advisory board of the Clean Fuels Foundation and the New Uses Council, and a trustee of the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments. Jim was also chairman of the executive committee of the Board of Regents of the Smithsonian Institution and a trustee of Stanford. He's also been a member of the National Commission on Terrorism, the Commission to Assess the Ballistic Missile Threat to the U.S., President's Commission on Federal Ethics Law Reform, the President's Blue Ribbon Commission on Defense Management, and the President's Commission on Strategic Forces. He served in the past as a member of many boards of directors, both of publicly held corporations and nonprofits. Some examples of the for-profit companies on which he served is Martin Marietta, British Aerospace, Fairchild Industries, and Uri Systems. And last year he was the Annenberg Distinguished Visiting Fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. So I think you'll agree with me that Jim is a very, very busy man, and we are delighted to have him here at UC Davis. So Jim, welcome.
Well, thank you, Steve. Thank you very much. It's a delight to be back at UC Davis. I've been here a couple of 3 times before, meeting with my old friend Andy Frank, whom I see out in the audience. Learned a lot from Andy about plug-in hybrids and cars generally. I thought it might be useful to answer preemptively a question I often get asked, which is, when you were out at the CIA, did you get to participate in any actual covert operations? And the answer, I haven't disclosed much about this before, but this seems like a small and discreet group, and the answer is, yeah, on one occasion I did, and I think I can give you the bare essentials. My wife and I were classmates at Stanford, and so when I'd been at the CIA about 8 months, 24/7 job, we decided we were going to take 3 days off, go to our Stanford reunion, cash in some old frequent flyer miles, go out first class, see old friends, go to the homecoming game. Well, the first thing that happened is my director of security at the CIA said, "Mr. Director, I'm afraid Mrs. Woolsey is going to have to go on a different flight because we can't have anybody named Woolsey on the flight." I said, "Wait a minute, my name's Woolsey." He said, "Oh, no, sir, you need to fly an alias." And, of course, my first thought was, uh-oh, there go the frequent flyer miles. So my wife goes out to the airport, gets on a flight to San Francisco, first class, sits back with her glass of wine and has a great trip. I get on another flight with my 2 security guys. In those simpler times, they just stop by the cockpit, show the pilot and the chief flight attendant that they're carrying weapons, that they're authorized to by the federal government. And then we go back to the back row of coach, right in front of the bulkhead where you can't even lean back. I'm wedged in between these 2 big guys for this 6.5-hour flight to California. We're walking down the jetway in San Francisco. No. Flight attendant comes over and whispers something to my security man. His nickname was Rock, and he was a big guy and a stolid guy. And he just cracked up. And I couldn't figure out, I'd never seen him guffaw like that. I said, "Rock, what's so funny?" He said, "You know what she said?" She said, "You know, I've been on these flights for 20 years, and that is the politest and best behaved prisoner that we've ever had on." So there are 2 good things about that. One is I successfully pulled off a covert op, getting to Stanford. And the other is that it was actually about the nicest thing anybody said about me in the 2 years that I was in the job. You don't tend to get many compliments as head of the CIA. Well, I thought I would share with you some thoughts about how we ought to consider deciding about what to do about energy, and where, as a nation, it would be a good idea for us to go. And I'm going to approach this a little differently than is standard. The standard way of approaching energy issues, particularly in the academic world these days, and in much of the Washington policy world, is to take one criterion, CO2 emissions, and one at a time analyze solutions, cellulosic ethanol for cars, for example, find that that solution will not solve the entire problem, reject it, and then go on to do the same thing with something else. It's basically a recipe for continuing despondency. I want to suggest two differences. One is that we should not think in terms of solely analysis, but also of synthesis, and try to come up with a portfolio of approaches to dealing with energy. And the portfolio needs to be big enough to do the job, but not to include everything. So what one often gets sometimes from energy companies' advertisements is that the answer is all of the above. No, sorry, can't afford all of the above. Need to focus some, but also not to assume that one solution is the right one. You might, for example, have put all your money in Bear Stearns, in which case you would probably not be happy. Not a single solution in synthesis. The other is the criteria. I think climate change is an important issue. Be glad to talk about it some in the Q's and A's if people want. But it's not the only issue we face. There really are three sets of issues. One is environmental, including both climate change and local pollution, such as SOx and NOx and particulates and knocking the tops off mountains in Appalachia. One set has to do with security. Can we make sure we're going to be getting the oil we need as long as we're depending in part on OPEC and the Middle East? What about terrorist attacks on various parts of our energy infrastructure? And the third has to do with the affordability and availability to the world of energy solutions. And by the world, I'm including what's sometimes called the bottom 2 billion. The 1.5 billion to 2 billion people in the world who effectively have no energy except maybe a tiny bit of electricity from a generator somewhere in their African village for a few minutes a day. So it is important that energy be actually available to people, not just theoretically available to them. Those three sets of criteria have to be looked at in terms of the threats to our being denied energy. And the way I characterize these in my mind is the environmental problems, the environmental threats, I characterize as concerns of one of the three friends I'm going to introduce you to today, the ghost of John Muir. John Muir, as I'm sure most everybody in this part of the world knows, was the father of the modern environmental movement. He was Teddy Roosevelt's great friend and the father of not only the Sierra Club, but of the whole national park system, et cetera. And Muir, were he alive today, would be concerned, I think, both about climate change and about individual types of pollution such as SOx and NOx and particulates and the rest. The second ghost, who I have my little conversations with, in a sense, is an individual who is deeply concerned about the security of the United States and of democracies in general and totally committed to protecting them, and that ghost is the ghost of George Patton. Patton is worried, in my little dialogue or trilogue that I'm going to suggest here, not only about oil cutoffs, but about using energy infrastructure, such as the electric grid and its cyber vulnerabilities, as an instrumentality or a way of attacking the United States or other friendly countries, and something that we have to concern ourselves with. And my third ghost is that of Mahatma Gandhi, who best symbolizes I think, a concern for the bottom 2 billion in the world, and for real availability of solutions as distinct from theories. If you look at a map, a satellite map of sub-Saharan Africa taken 30 years ago at night, except for a few spots in Nigeria and a few spots in South Africa, it's almost completely dark because there's essentially no electricity. If you look at that same map, satellite map at night of sub-Saharan Africa, a picture taken, say, yesterday, it will look almost exactly like the picture taken 30 years ago. Dark, no electricity. Because although there have been a few projects, big dams and so forth, that have actually come into existence, generally speaking, the grand plans of the World Bank or others to come up with huge energy projects for sub-Saharan Africa never seem to work out. They never seem to actually get built for one reason or another. Gandhi is concerned about that. Gandhi likes local control. In his Salt March and his other marches to try to bring independence to India, he always carried with him a chakra, which is an Indian spinning wheel, and that chakra is in the middle of the Indian flag. What it symbolizes, among other things, is local self-sufficiency. Gandhi would spin cotton 2 hours a day when he was on his marches. What he was saying to the world was that you should not, if you can avoid it, just pick cotton and ship it off to England or someplace to be processed. If you have been spinning cotton for thousands of years in Indian villages, perfect it, modernize it, continue to do it, become important in the economic change, take responsibility in part for your own control over your own economic life. So Muir, Patton, and Gandhi all, to me at least, kind of symbolize different but equally important concerns about energy. And if you are only dealing with one of them, or only part of what one of them is worried about, say CO2, I don't think you are approaching a reasonable resolution of the problem in a comprehensive way. So what I'm going to do is say a few words about each of our two major energy systems, electricity and transportation, and look at each one briefly through the eyes of each of my three ghosts, and then see where that may lead us and throw it open to any questions that you might have. We have several smaller energy systems used for oil, for home heating, et cetera, in the country, but generally speaking, our two biggest ones and the two biggest in the world are electricity generation and transportation. Electricity generation in the United States is fueled 51% by coal and the rest by a mixture of nuclear, gas, hydro, and a little bit of renewables. Transportation is fueled 96% by oil products of one kind or another, and 3/4 of that oil, conventional oil, is controlled by OPEC. One way you know that someone doesn't know a damn thing about energy is if he says to you, our big problem is oil imports, because we import close to 2/3 of our oil. Here's how we're going to solve it. We're going to build nuclear power plants or wind farms or whatever. It may be a good idea to build nuclear power plants or wind farms or whatever in order to produce electricity, but today it has essentially nothing to do with oil demand. You could build nuclear power plants and wind farms forever, and if you still stayed 96% oil fueling your transportation and virtually no oil being used to produce electricity, you're not going to do anything about oil by building nuclear power plants and wind farms. We'll get back in a minute to that because that might change in the future. But today, it's not like the 1970s when 20% of our electricity came from oil. It doesn't anymore, so you can't solve our oil import problem by building power plants. Now, let's look first at electricity. What types of programs should we focus on for the future? And what would each of our three ghosts say about them? Well, let's look at Muir first. Muir has two concerns. One is local pollution, SOx, NOx, particulates knocking mountaintops off in Appalachia. That's almost entirely a coal problem. Almost entirely. The other ways of producing electric power that we actually use today don't create environmental problems like that. Coal does, big time. What about climate change? Well, nuclear and hydro don't, in their operation, essentially contribute anything to climate change, CO2 emissions. Natural gas is about a third of coal's contribution per kilowatt, per installed kilowatt, or per generated kilowatt hour, let's say, in CO2 emissions, because natural gas has about half as much CO2 in it as coal, but natural gas plants are considerably more efficient than coal plants. So when you're using natural gas, you're putting out about a third of the CO2 that you are if you're using coal to generate electricity. So CO2 is a small bit, natural gas problem, and in the electricity field, hugely a coal problem. From Muir's point of view, coal, big time, is the issue. Can we deal with coal by capturing and sequestering the carbon, producing clean coal someday? Yes, maybe. My judgment, likely to be awfully expensive, in part because the infrastructure of pipelines for CO2 you would need in order to capture the CO2 from the coal-fired power plants, move it all over the country in order to put it down into the deep saline aquifers where it probably would have to go, would be an infrastructure approximately as large as the existing infrastructure of oil and gas pipelines. So not a small step, possibly doable, but I tend not to turn that way if one is looking toward how to generate electricity. Okay, it is often said, you care about CO2, go nuclear. We haven't built a nuclear power plant for 30 years because of some stupid reason, people say, and let's get the government into the business of funding nuclear power plants and build them. It's clean and cheap to operate. Let's go. Couple of problems. First of all, nuclear power plants per installed watt cost between 4 and 5 times what natural gas plants do. They're very cheap to operate, but extremely expensive to build, which is why the market hasn't built any in 30 years, and they will only be built with very substantial federal subsidies. Well, still, CO2 is an important issue. We may well need to go that way in spite of the expense of construction and the need for that kind of a subsidy. What, if anything else, is wrong with nuclear power? I would suggest this. Back in the early 90s, we had underway work going on, some of it at Livermore, at the national laboratories, on different types of nuclear cycles. Fast converter reactors that essentially eat their own waste. Thorium cycle that's a lot less likely to be able to be diverted into nuclear weapons than what we have today. You can get disagreements among experts about whether or not those would be adequate in keeping us away from having a nuclear reactor be a source of fissile material for nuclear weapons. But there's very little plausible disagreement with the following proposition. Assuming we are going to have to stay with light water reactors of the current type for a substantial period of time, while new technologies may be invented, building added nuclear reactors in the US and getting back into the nuclear business is almost certainly going to push the companies that get into that to keep their costs down by selling such reactors as widely as possible. Now, if there weren't a proliferation problem, we might say It doesn't matter that when we sell nuclear reactors abroad, we won't always be selling to, say, Switzerland, and we may be selling to Saudi Arabia, to Egypt, etc. But the problem is that with the current type of light water reactors and the current international treaty regime, the Non-Proliferation Treaty, every light water reactor is a potential source of the fissile material one needs for the nuclear weapons, because the current treaty regime does not keep you out of enriching uranium or reprocessing plutonium. And when you enrich uranium up to the 5% level that you need for producing electricity, you are about 2/3, maybe nearly 3/4 of the way in terms of the work that needs to be done toward enriching it up to the level of 90% or so that you need for a nuclear weapon. North Korea has shown this. Iran has shown this. If you are selling light water reactors to anybody who wants to buy them, including, say, countries like Egypt and Saudi Arabia, which are very much on the list, you are a Johnny Appleseed of nuclear weapons. You are moving around the earth planting future nuclear weapons, because the weapon itself is pretty easy to design. The problem is getting the fissile material. And the fissile material, especially highly enriched uranium, can come just from the enrichment process. So we got a big problem with nukes. In a different world, a different international treaty regime, a world, as Tennyson, I think, put it, where there's a parliament of man, where everybody's a democracy, where there's full transparency, where countries don't cheat. In that imaginary world, this might be fine. But short of that, we got a real problem with nukes. Well, what else can you use for baseload? Clearly, Woolsey, people are saying, yeah, you're an enthusiast for solar and wind and this renewable stuff, but you know, the sun only shines in the daytime, and on days like this, not necessarily in the daytime. The wind generally blows at night. It's going to take a long time to get enough renewables in. What are you going to use for your base load of electricity so we don't have to give up hot showers and cold beer while we're headed toward this lovely renewable future out there somewhere in the future? I would suggest the most likely base load for the foreseeable future now is natural gas. Gas does produce some CO2, but so much less than coal, it's not, I think, nearly as much a problem as coal, and it essentially produces none of the other types of pollution, except that the new gas shale formations that are being discovered and have radically increased people's estimates of how much natural gas is available in this country and around the world have to be exploited by a process called hydrofracturing or fracking, which, if you look, for example, front page story in yesterday's Wall Street Journal, may create problems with the water that's been put under pressure and pumped into the well, fracturing it, enabling the extraction of natural gas, the water coming back up out of the well, having a lot of pollutants attached to it, needs to be cleaned or disposed of. It's an issue. It's something we got to deal with. We can't just go polluting every place that is sitting on top of a gas field. But, at least in my judgment, there is likely to be more than one technological solution to this, but we need to get on it and work on it. If we solve the pollution water problem from hydrofracturing, natural gas has some rather remarkable opportunities as a baseload. The reason we haven't gone to it more than we have in the past is not the cost of new plants, they're low. By the way, if you're driving along the freeway and you see a flatbed truck passing you and it has what looks like an aircraft engine on it, maybe an aircraft engine or it may be a natural gas plant. Smallest ones are effectively aircraft engines. So natural gas also, by the way, lends itself to cogeneration, capturing the waste heat from the generation of electricity and using it a second time, say to heat a building or otherwise, The Danes, by the way, get about a third of their electricity from cogeneration of that sort. We get about 5 or 6% of ours from it in the United States, just because public utility commissions haven't wanted to get into it. They'd rather have people build power plants, I suppose. But natural gas has some real advantages with cogeneration. And it is, at least in apparently, from the sites where one can get the shale and how broadly dispersed they are, it creates a possibility of getting gas from a wide range of places. Good news potentially for Europe. Natural gas production in Europe would free the Europeans from the whims of Mr. Putin, who, whenever he gets mad at somebody, seems to turn off their natural gas. Happily, we don't have the same problem with Canada. We get about a third of we get about 15% of our natural gas from Canada, but since they whipped us twice when we tried to conquer them in the late 1770s and 1812, and we've given up on whipping them. The Canadians continue to be rather nice to us. We get along with them reasonably well. We don't have the same problem the Europeans do with Russia. The other thing about natural gas is it's easily turned on and off, and so it's a good way to do what's called firm renewables. The two things you need to do with renewables if you're going to move heavily toward them. One is develop excellent and better electricity storage, probably in batteries, but maybe in other devices as well, because electricity's big problem is that it's a just-in-time system. You have to produce it just as you're using it with very minor changes. And if you can move away from that, produce electricity in the daytime from solar, store it enough that you can use it in the early evening, and mate it up with natural gas that's relatively easily turned on and off, you may be able to have a partnership, essentially, between storage improvements, natural gas, larger availability, far more affordably than it was looking to be the case before the shale discoveries, and renewables. Interesting set of possibilities. What about renewables? Several have potential promise. Geothermal in the western part of the United States, small-scale hydro in streams and rivers where you don't have to build a dam. You can just have a propeller, a turbine essentially under the water. There are several possibilities, but the two biggest are probably solar and wind. And today, some large-scale solar and wind plants are obtaining cost levels that are looking more and more attractive. Thermal solar in the Mojave Desert, wind farms in Texas and central part of the United States. The problem is that once you generate the electricity from the sun in the Mojave or from the wind in Kansas, you got to get it to where people are. And today, in a lot of circumstances, you will take a year or so building a thermal solar plant in the Mojave or building a wind farm in Texas or Kansas, and then you'll litigate or have permit proceedings for 7, 8, 9, 10 years, and you will eventually end up, if you can ever get hooked up to a transmission line, you will eventually in order to avoid the Indian burial grounds and the snail darters and so forth, your transmission line will sort of look like that. And maybe it'll get in a few years and maybe it won't. Transmission, long-distance transmission, therefore, creates some serious blockage to actually having the power in hand. Quick word about what Patton thinks about electricity. He's got two main concerns. Attacks on the electricity grid, particularly on the transformers by terrorist groups, and hacking into the SCADA, supervisory control and data acquisition systems that control the grid. The transformers especially are extremely vulnerable and extremely important to the system. The big transformers that hike up the voltage so electricity can be transmitted long distances and then step it down again. They aren't made in the United States anymore, the two biggest ones. They're made in South Korea and Northern Europe. You got to stand in line for quite a while to get one. They tend to be tailored to individual uses, so at this point at least yet, you don't have modular ones. They're very big and very difficult to move. And the utilities have this interesting habit of, if they should have a spare transformer, storing it outside in the electric substation behind the cyclone fence, often just a few feet from the highway, storing it right next to the operating transformer. That puts a heavy burden on a terrorist. He has a 30-06, let's say, with armor-piercing rounds in it. He has to pull off the road and fire 2 shots instead of 1 in order to take out not only the operating transformer, but its spare. The U.S. electric grid is not the only part of our infrastructure that's vulnerable. We have 13 major critical infrastructures, including water provision, sewage pumping, et cetera. All 12 of the others depend on electricity. So if the electricity goes down, all the others do too. And if the electricity is down accidentally, tree branch touching a power line, as occurred in Cleveland back in, I think, 03, taking out 50 million consumers from electric power for several days in the northeastern U.S. and eastern Canada, then if it's over in a few days and you've got a home generator and some diesel, and the hospitals certainly do, and so forth, you'll probably get through it all right. But, by the way, when that happened and Cleveland's power line touched by a tree branch took out northeastern U.S. and eastern Canada, several days, 50 million consumers, billions of dollars, we tried to take a leaf from the book of the South Park kids and blame Canada. The Canadians, however, in their polite way, pointed out to us that actually Cleveland is south of Lake Erie, not north. And we had to admit it was our tree branch and our power line. And the real problem, as Patton would point out to you, is that terrorists are a lot smarter than tree branches. They do not have to just go after a power line. They can go after the transformers. So that's one of Patton's concerns. The other is that whereas the control systems for the electric grid used to operate largely locally, and most of us generated our electricity locally, and if we got into a real bind, we'd buy a bit of electricity from a neighboring grid. Having gone to deregulation in the late 1990s, we're now trying to move and buy electricity from all over the grid, and those who are responsible for doing it care a great deal about a tiny fraction of a penny in cost. So we've got a national grid really stressed with trying to keep up with what we're doing with electricity. And in order to make that work, we have gone to more and more off-the-shelf software for a lot of computers and off-the-shelf firewalls. Let me tell you how effective those firewalls are. They do a great job of keeping hackers out as long as the hackers are only in elementary school. But once you get into junior high school and you're pretty good at some of those video games, you're through those SCADA firewalls about as fast as a hot knife through butter. So we have an electric grid on which everything depends, because without electricity, you're not back in the 1970s pre-web, you're back in the 1870s pre-electricity. And you probably aren't going to be able to find that manual pump handle for the well in your backyard so you get drinking water. You probably forgot to have that plow horse in the back of your house to help you plow a field to plant food crops. We're back in the 1870s without anything that made it possible for people even to survive in the 1870s, if the grid goes down for a substantial period of time as a result of a terrorist attack or hacking attacks. So Patton, to put it mildly, has some major problems with our current electricity structure. He notes that if the grid were just distributed, if you had local generation in a lot of places of electricity, and you could island if other parts of the grid went down, you would not have the electricity available you'd need to, say, run a local aluminum plant. You need bulk power from the transmission grid for that. But if you had some local solar and wind and natural gas, you might at least be able for the community to be able to have about half the electricity that it normally has and to keep things functioning at a bare bones level. It might not be pleasant, but it wouldn't be a total catastrophe as would be the complete loss of electricity. So Patton, for his own security reasons, has some real interest in distributed generation of electricity. Gandhi remembers those maps of sub-Saharan Africa and doesn't really believe that the big power plants are ever going to show up. Now, India gets about half of its electricity from coal and from big power plants, but there are huge numbers of outages. It's a serious problem, and in some parts of the world less developed than India, it's a gigantic problem. If you could generate electricity locally at the village level, Gandhi begins to think of power and energy and electricity somewhat the way he was thinking of weaving cloth with his chakra. So all three of my ghosts have big worries about electricity, and for all three of them, moving toward distributed generation of renewables and natural gas with appropriate moves toward making things more secure and making things more available at a local level begins to appeal to them. Muir hopes that, since he really wants to get away from CO2, he hopes that if you've got some power plants and wind farms in Kansas or solar power plants in the Mojave that are already on transmission lines and you can get going, that we would. But as a general proposition, he's very interested, all three of them, in distributed generation of renewables and gas. They tend to be able to agree on that. If they turn to transportation, they could all also agree, I would think, that Andy Frank and some of his colleagues have started something pretty interesting some years ago, namely the electrification of transportation. Are we going to be able to move really quickly toward all electric vehicles? Well, if you've got a spare 100,000 and you want to put it in a sports car like Tesla, great. They're wonderful little things. But short of that, and short of full electrification, plug-in hybrids have some real possibilities. Because first of all, you may be able to produce enough electricity locally to drive 20, 30, 40 miles a day. And since the average car in the US goes 25 miles and 3/4 cars go less than 40 miles a day, if you are electrified in part, as in a plug-in hybrid, you are an all-electric vehicle, say with a 40-mile Chevy Volt, you're an all-electric vehicle 3 days out of 4. Now with a plug-in hybrid, when you get to the end of that 25 or 30 or 40 miles, do you have to find a plug? No, only if you want to drive at roughly 2 cents a mile instead of 6, 8, 10 cents a mile. If you're willing to keep going at 6, 8, 10 cents a mile, then you can go with liquid fuel that's in the tank, either with an alternate drivetrain, as with a Prius that's been converted, or with the little 1-liter engine with its liquid fuel supply that just charges the battery on a Chevy Volt and keeps you going. So you have a range of 200, 300 miles. It's just that on most days, you don't get into the need for using liquid fuel. And if Patton, Muir, and Gandhi got your electricity reoriented in terms of distributed generation, that 20, 30, 40 miles for an average day might well come from your roof. I drive a plug-in hybrid today. I drive the first 20 and have electric photovoltaic cells on the roof of my farmhouse, batteries in the basement. So if I want to show off and go off grid for the day, I can't have as much electricity as I otherwise would, but I can quite literally drive about my first 25 miles on sunlight. These are not theories. These are programs and products that are coming into the market if we get them organized well. What other things might you want to do to deal with your oil dependence problem? Oh, by the way, in terms of cleanliness, Muir doesn't have a big problem with this, because even though you're driving on electricity, Natural Resources Defense Council, Pacific Northwest National Laboratories, and EPRI have all done studies and said in the nation as a whole, on average, going from a vehicle that's all gasoline to one that's a plug-in hybrid, say 25, 30-mile plug-in hybrid, reduces your global warming gas emissions by something in the range of 10 to 15%, and that's nation average as a whole. In a clean grid state like California, which uses very little coal, some from across borders, but California's grid is quite clean. In a clean grid state like California, you improve your global warming gas emissions by going to a plug-in hybrid by about 80 to 90%. So as the grid cleans up, Muir is very happy that the cars will be cleaned up at the same time. Patton has a lot of worries about oil dependence, so he would be glad to see electrification of transportation or anything that gets us off oil, because he notes that 8 out of 9 of the largest oil exporting countries in the world are dictatorships or autocratic kingdoms. Only nice Norway is kind of in strange company there. Canada's 10th, by the way, so 8 of the top 10 or 8 of the top 9 are dictatorships or autocratic kingdoms. It is also very much on Patton's mind that the 22 countries in the world that depend on oil for 2/3 or more of their national income are all dictatorships and autocratic kingdoms. Every one. Patton is also very attentive to the fact that, as Bernard Lewis puts it, there should be no taxation without representation, but it's also true that there's no representation without taxation. In other words, if you're so rich from imported oil that you don't need taxes, you tend not to have a real legislature, and the big oil exporters don't. Now, a country like Canada or Norway that's already a functioning democracy and has a diverse economy and gets a large amount of oil doesn't become a dictatorship, but something that's already a dictatorship or autocratic kingdom tends to have that tendency enhanced by being dependent on a commodity that has a huge amount of economic rent associated with it. Professor Paul Collier of Oxford is probably the leading individual in establishing this theory of what's sometimes called the oil curse, and is summed up very well by Tom Friedman in his book Hot, Flat, and Crowded in a chapter called Fill Her Up with Dictators. So Patton sees most of the trouble coming at the United States and the democracies in the world in the future, coming from states that we are paying for their oil. He also notes that we borrow at $70 a barrel oil, we borrow about $1 billion a day to finance our oil imports, just the imports, which are approaching 2/3 of our oil. And Patton is also more than slightly worried about Saudi Arabia. He points out that Lawrence Wright, the author of The Looming Tower, I think is the best book, by the way, on Al-Qaeda and 9/11. Wright says in there that with between 1% and 2% of the world's Muslims, the Saudis control approximately 90% of the world's Islamic institutions. That's paid for by the hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars a year the world ships to OPEC, and Saudis in particular. And so we find that this war on terrorism that we're in, or call it contingency operations abroad if you want to be more politically correct, is the only war, I guess, since the Civil War the United States has ever fought in where we pay for both sides. Not a real sound strategy, Patton says. He even says to those who will listen to him this. He said, if you want to know, given those facts, if you want to know who is paying for these little 8, 9, 10-year-old boys in madrasas in Pakistan or the West Bank to be taught that their highest aspiration in life should be to become a suicide bomber, if you want to know who's paying for that, next time you pull into a filling station, Patton says, before you get out to charge your gas, turn the rearview mirror just a couple of inches so you're looking into your own eyes. Now you know who's paying for those little Palestinian and Pakistani boys to be taught to be suicide bombers. So Patton has big-time problems with oil. Electrification, that appeals to him as a substitute. Advanced biofuels appeal to him. He understands, along with Muir and Gandhi, that it's going to be a lot easier to use advanced biofuels if they're drop-in fuels. That is, if they're diesel coming from, let's say, algae, or if they are biobutanol coming from waste products, if they're a fuel that can be integrated into existing fuel supply systems and pipelines and so forth without difficulty and complexity and without building added facilities. He also is excited about the prospect of improvements, largely using electronics and internal combustion engines that'll require the fuel to be used less. And he even is perfectly happy to think of natural gas being used for fleet vehicles like school buses and for interstate trucking. He and Gandhi and Muir are all a bit worried about trying to have natural gas fuel the family car, because then you need natural gas pumps at all the filling stations, and that's a big investment in infrastructure. But for trucks, maybe fine. So Patton and Muir can get along fine on an approach toward transportation which uses the distributed generation of electricity for electrification in part of transportation, which uses advanced biofuels, which uses improvements in mileage from improved internal combustion engines, and which uses, to some extent, natural gas. And he points out that if you come at oil from all of those directions simultaneously, you may be able to move an awful lot faster than if you're trying to move with only one of those solutions alone. Gandhi has listened to all this so far. He loves the distributed generation for the reasons I described, and transportation, he has no problem at all with having transportation proceed from electrified vehicles that have the power generated locally. My three ghosts, again, after thinking it through, have a generally common approach toward transportation and a generally common approach toward generation of electricity. Is each of the three totally satisfied with everything? No. Muir would have preferred a bigger emphasis on everything being renewable as soon as possible. But real progress toward renewables seems possible, and the compromise with natural gas is one that he can live with. The main thing Patton says that he wants to stress is that whereas coal is an environmental and CO2 problem, oil is a CO2, an environmental, and security problem. In addition to fixing the vulnerabilities of the electricity grid, we have to, Patton says, do something radical about oil. His analogy, which was first picked up by my friend Annie Coren in her writings, is that we need, he says, to turn oil into salt. And what he means by that is up until the beginning of the 20th century, salt was a strategic commodity. It was the only way to preserve meat. It was hugely important to the human food chain. Those who produced salt had a total monopoly on preserving meat, and so salt was a very big deal. Countries went to war over salt mines as recently as the 1880s. With the coming of the electric grids at the end of the 1890s and into the early 20th century, refrigeration and freezing became widely available, and people realized that frozen and thawed meat tasted an awful lot better than meat that had been soaked in salt brine, and it was, by the way, cheaper. Given the salt monopoly prices, it was cheaper to freeze meat than it was to soak it in salt brine. So, within a very few years, salt was destroyed as a strategic commodity. It wasn't destroyed, period. You will see some on your table at dinner this evening. But I doubt if you will look at it and say, you know, I wonder if we're salt independent. I wonder where that comes from. Do we import as much as 2/3 of our salt? You don't care. Because unless you're Long and Morton's, salt is boring. We need, patent says, to do that to oil. The ultimate objective is as soon as possible, make oil boring. Thank you. Oh, they're going to use those, okay.
Jim, thank you. Jim, thank you very much for those fascinating remarks. And if you'd permit me, I'd like to begin with the first question. We're delighted to have a number of our students and alumni here today from the Graduate School of Management. And so in addition to being fascinated with your comments about technology and security and policy issues, they might also be very interested in your fascinating career and its evolution. So I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about some key point and experience that you had in your career that led you onto this path, in particular in security-related issues and government policy.
You sure you want me to do this? Okay. All right. I was born to two Scoop Jackson Democrats, and I'm a Scoop Jackson Democrat. These days, you'd probably call me a Joe Lieberman Democrat or near Democrat. And so I've always been kind of conservative on foreign policy issues and kind of liberal on domestic stuff. In law school in 67, 68, my last year in law school, I got sufficiently fed up with Westmoreland's search and destroy operations in Vietnam that I founded Yale Citizens for Eugene McCarthy for president. I was effectively the head of the anti-war movement at Yale in 67, 68. And let me tell you, it takes a lot to get me into an anti-war movement, but Westmoreland managed. And so I spent a chunk of my time, my last year in law school, getting lots of people to get clean for Gene and shave their beards and go up to New Hampshire and go door to door and all the stuff we did that got 42% of the vote in the 68 presidential primary for McCarthy and caused Johnson to withdraw from the race for the presidency and to replace Westmoreland with Abrams and so forth. I went on active duty in the summer of 68, right at the end of this, because I had an ROTC commission and my own personal views on the war in political terms, I thought should not affect my obligation to serve in the military, which I had, so I went on active duty. I had written a piece for Yale on cost-effectiveness analysis and program budgeting for urban police departments for the Law Journal. It was noticed by a man named Alan Enthoven, who was running a panel, a group, a small staff for the Secretary of Defense doing cost-effectiveness analysis of all kinds of military matters. So he offered me a job in the Pentagon, and I was sitting in a vault, actually, doing cost-effectiveness analysis of how to design reconnaissance satellites, when a few months later, in January of '69, my wife and I got invited to an engagement party. It was the engagement party of an old friend of ours from Stanford who was marrying the daughter of the Deputy Secretary of Defense, Paul Nitze. Nitze, wonderful man, had served presidents going back, FDR, all the way, long time. And Nitze, very much a member of the Washington establishment. The engagement party was 200 or 300 people, black tie, F Street Club, 6 courses, the Dean Achesons, it was ta-ta. With a few of us who were much younger and were going to be in the wedding party. Somehow, standing in the middle of the F Street Club at this black tie reception before this big dinner, Lieutenant Woolsey and Deputy Secretary of Defense Nitze get into a loud and angry argument about the Vietnam War. Nitze, we each had champagne flutes, which had been emptied. Nitze starts poking at me with his champagne flute. I poke back but retreat, sort of like a young upstart having challenged D'Artagnan. I'm pinned against the windows, fending him off. His wife comes and hauls him in. Everybody goes in for dinner. Driving home that evening, I said to my wife, well, Nitze and I got in a little discussion about the war. And she said, yeah, everybody noticed. I said, but, you know, it doesn't matter. He's only going to be around another couple of weeks, and then the Republicans come in, so I forget about it. Well, that's true. Nothing happened. And then about 3 months later, along about March or April, Nitze comes back because everybody wants Nitze to work for him. And Laird, the new Secretary of Defense, needs somebody to go over and negotiate with the Soviets in Helsinki and Vienna about strategic nuclear weapons. It's this new idea, arms control negotiations. And so my boss gives me a call. And he says, Jim, Nitze's back. I said, yeah, I heard. And he said, you know, he's going to go over and negotiate with the Soviets in Helsinki and Vienna about all our strategic forces. And he needs an assistant. He needs somebody to draft the statements and to keep track of stuff. And, you know, you're a lawyer. It might be a treaty, might be some legal work involved. And you've been working on intelligence. That may be relevant. Would you be interested? And I said, well, you know, I can't think of anything I'd rather do as a lieutenant in the Army than go over to Helsinki and Vienna and negotiate with the Soviets about strategic weapons. Sounds pretty interesting. But I said, I've only met Nitze once, and it didn't go real well. And Charles kind of grinned and said, well, that must be what he meant. I said, what do you mean? He said, well, I mentioned your name to him, and he paused for a minute. And then after a minute, he kind of grinned. And he said, yeah, he said, that's fine. He said, send Woolsey on up. He may not know what the hell he's talking about, but at least he'll speak up. So, I rarely give career guidance to people on how to get into a government career. What worked for me was being a brash kid and getting into an argument at a black-tie dinner he was hosting for his daughter's engagement with the Deputy Secretary of Defense as a lieutenant in the Army, and the marvelous man hired me really because I'd gotten in the argument with him, because that's what Paul Nitze was like. What it says about me is I was a brash kid. What it says about him, and he was a remarkable man. I guess I'd say the most important thing is see if you can find somebody like Nitze, somebody who wants you to argue with him, to present alternate views, not to say, yes, sir, whatever you say, sir. If the person only wants you to say, yes, sir, whatever you say, sir, it probably will be a pretty boring job, and it may not be a very useful one. But if you find somebody like that, and I was just lucky, if you find somebody like Paul Nitze, almost no matter what he or she is working on, go work with them. That's what I'd say. Other questions? Yes, sir.
Thank you for your talk. I wanted to get your opinion on how yesterday's Supreme Court ruling might influence the ability of folks like yourself to get that message out, considering that the money behind oil is as significant as it is.
I haven't read the decision or the article yet, so you got to give me a very brief précis.
Basically removing the restrictions on corporations to contribute to political candidates.
Well, you know, I don't think that's something that's likely to, as described, damage the First Amendment rights of those of us who are not speaking for corporations. I mean, I don't mind. Given my views on oil, I've had some differences of opinion with some representatives of some very large companies, and they say what they think about me, and I say what I think about them and their policies. And some of them are moving into what I would regard as some very useful and interesting areas, such as natural gas. And others complained about me, for example, to Booz Allen when I was an officer at Booz Allen. And I'm proud to say Booz Allen shrugged and said, well, that's just Woolsey. Woolsey sounds off. You know, so I don't see that this ought to make it impossible for people as individuals to say what they think. And that's the essence of the First Amendment. If the Supreme Court thinks that corporations ought to be able to give political contributions and be more influential than they are now, then you're going to have a lot of corporations, probably from different types of interests in energy. I would imagine you're going to have, you know, some of the new renewable energy companies contributing to one type of candidate, and some of those who are in the heartland and are focused heavily on coal and railroads to contribute to another type of candidate. But, you know, let's slug it out. Would be my instinct.
Yeah, I have a question. You'd mentioned that you would hope that we would turn oil into salt. I'm worried that we're going to turn lithium into oil. Most of the batteries that are going into these plug-in hybrids require lithium, I believe, is the current technology. And most of them, lithium's coming from Bolivia, China, Democratic Republic of Congo. Are we trading one set of dictators for another?
Well,
and if so, why not gasify a private transportation like T. Boone Pickens had suggested?
Well, Pickens, just to be clear, Pickens at first suggested fleet vehicles and trucks and implied private cars as well. And then he got into a bunch of dialogue with people. By the way, I take my hat off to a guy who's a billionaire who just kind of gets in there and slugs it out with everybody and says what he thinks. And he kind of adjusted his views, and he's backed off sort of on the private cars side. He tends to, because of the infrastructure requirements. He still is pushing hard on trucks and fleet vehicles, and I think he's right on those. And as far as lithium itself goes, there's a lot happening in batteries. Batteries, photovoltaic cells, LEDs for lighting, all kind of depend in one way or another on materials science, and those are the things that I think are changing the fastest. And some of the things that are happening in batteries are nanotechnology is coming along, different types of lithium compounds, some of which require different amounts of lithium, are the subject of a lot of investigation. But the stockpile of lithium now that's inexpensive is generally in Chile and Argentina. The Bolivian, and China to some extent, the Bolivian lithium is very hard to get at and isn't being exploited now. It's a little bit like the oil sands in western Colorado and in the United States, which have a huge amount of oil in them, but very expensive and very hard to get at. Also, lithium can be recycled. And I think it's an important thing to watch, but I don't think it's a problem yet. I would trade almost anybody for the oil guys. And in a sense, kind of bet on the come. But I do think that probably the best thing to read on this is Annie Corin, whom I mentioned, and her colleague at her think tank, Gal Luft, K-O-R-I-N, and Luft, L-U-F-T, have written this book, Turning Oil into Salt, and I think it's the last chapter of that book is a pretty good survey of the lithium availability in the lithium mining world, and it's worth looking at. It's a complicated problem, but it's important to solve it right. I think you're right. Yes.
I guess I have the microphone. I'd like to go back to a comment you made towards the beginning of your talk. California recently has engaged in a very focused public policy process that's making CO2 reduction, greenhouse gas reduction, an extremely important, if not the most important, objective for a whole range of regulatory activities. And I think we probably face the same process at the federal level through the EPA. Do you care to comment on that, on the dominance of greenhouse gas reduction as a regulatory measure?
I haven't followed the California process especially, but I tend to think that, I mean, I was a strong supporter of cap and trade until the House of Representatives got hold of it. I thought that although a carbon tax was a simpler way to move people away from heavily CO2 emitting ways of producing electricity, and even though cap and trade had some difficulties, for example, cap and trade has almost nothing to do about oil. $1 a ton of CO2 price in a cap and trade system is about a penny a gallon at the pump. So if you had a CO2 price about $25 a ton, like Europe has kind of bounced around recently, that adds 25 cents a gallon to the cost of gasoline. It's not enough to make much difference. The cap and trade is largely a stationary source matter. You got to deal with oil different ways. But let's assume we're just talking about stationary sources. I thought it would probably be a reasonable and perhaps a politically more acceptable way to effectively put added charges on CO2 emissions and heavily on coal. Then the House of Representatives got hold of it, and the coal and railroad lobbyists really earned their bonuses for the year, because the bill as it passed the House gives all kinds of advantages to coal for a long period of time. It eventually would have some effect on moving us away from coal, but it wouldn't be for quite a while. I was having dinner a few nights after the House bill passed with the president of one of the country's big and important environmental organizations. And he said, Jim, what's the fastest way to get CO2 emissions down to the levels that we're looking at for the next 20 years? I said, you can do it within a year. You just turn off the coal plants and turn on the natural gas plants, because the grid is about 1/5 to 1/4 utilized at night, and there's a lot of spare capacity for peaking that is largely, not heavily, but not entirely, but largely natural gas. And instead of dispatching 95% of your capacity in coal, start turning the coal down, especially the old coal-fired power plants, and utilize gas more. And he said, exactly, I completely agree. Why did the House of Representatives do exactly the opposite? He said. I said, I don't know, but the coal lobbyists really did well. The railroads are in there too, by the way, because they make an awful lot of their money by hauling coal around. So we've got the only way, unless a Senate bill is fantastic, any kind of a compromise between a Senate bill and this House bill is still going to be pretty pro-coal. I tend to think that the simplest way to deal with coal is probably a regulatory system. It won't help much in California, because California doesn't really have coal within its borders, but it does buy coal-fired electricity from across borders in, I think, Arizona and mainly. But it's not principally a California issue, but for the country as a whole, the only way we may be able to get away from generating huge amounts of CO2, and for that matter, knocking the tops off mountains in Appalachia and SOx and NOx and so forth, may well be to use the EPA regulatory process to just knock coal sideways. And frankly, I don't have any problem with that. Politically, it could be difficult because people will say it's, you know, it's not following, the coal lobbyists especially, coal companies, will say it's not following the general direction of the bill, and that's right. But the bill is a serious, serious problem. Who's got the mic?
Jim,
Hey, Andy.
thank you very much for your comments. It's great to hear you speak always, but and I agree with everything you say. There is one thing that I don't agree with, and but your ghost may agree with. Patton and Gandhi both may agree at the same time, although they're usually on both sides of a fence. Nevertheless, oil and coal, as you just mentioned, has probably the most money in the entire world. And so what you're suggesting is that we should say, okay, guys, we're going to knock you sideways. I heard you say that just a minute ago. And now with this new ruling from the Supreme Court about advertising, they're going to get the entire country against you. So my suggestion is, what do you think of this idea, is the question. How about having oil and coal guys dig as much oil out of the ground as possible, mine as much coal as they want to, but don't allow them to burn it. Don't use it for energy. Use it, in turn, for plastic materials. In fact, you're sitting on plastic materials. Why not encourage them to do one and only one thing with their product? That is, to make it into product or plastic materials that's useful for society forever. Because plastic can be recycled. Now, that makes them actually a more valuable company because they're creating product for the world forever. And this way, you solve two problems at the same time. You get them to stop creating CO2, and we stop them, we create product, let's say 2x4s to build houses, and we stop cutting down forests.
Well, Andy, as I would have expected from when you first introduced me to the notion of plug-in hybrids, I hear ideas from you that I don't hear from anybody else. And there's a real value in the proposition that if we can use coal and oil in ways that don't release CO2, then why not? I think the problem is the volume. I think the problem is that although we largely use oil and sometimes gas to make chemicals today, it's only about, I think, maybe 3 or 4%, something like that, of our oil use. And so I don't know that there is enough volumetric need for the plastics or other materials that oil and coal could be used for. But like anything you come up with, it's something we ought to look into. I've been intrigued by the fact that oil is facing competition with some of the companies using waste products and cellulosic products and the like to produce things like plastics and polyurethane and so on. And since I'm kind of single-mindedly focused on reducing the need by substituting with other things, that was kind of where I was headed. But if there's some way to use coal and oil in a way that doesn't emit CO2 or other pollutants, it's worth a look. Worth a look. Yes.
It seems like one of the problems we're going to be facing, especially in the next 10 to 20 years, is the infrastructure in the U.S., the transportation infrastructure. The roads and highways are in an increasing state of disrepair. I think anybody who drives between here and San Francisco and doesn't hit a dinner-sized pothole is lucky. Having said that, everything you talked about is great, but it still seems to be solutions focused around the car. What role do you think mass transit's going to play? I mean, it seems like an area that we're really in California having a lot of trouble getting momentum behind, but it seems like an area with a lot of promise.
It's important, and there is a lot that can be done with it, including modification of existing mass transit systems and expansion of them. But the problem is, however much we do with that, we're not going to be able to deal a body blow at oil, I think, without changing the fuel that we drive on. Because this is largely a nation of some people living in big cities, but an awful lot living in suburbs and exurbs. A lot of families in which one member is commuting for 20, 30 miles, another is picking up kids at school, dropping them off at the soccer game, in the meantime going to the grocery store, and it's a life and a society that is built around the automobile, and for most people, the flexibility that the automobile brings. So whereas a more European style lifestyle in which apartment buildings are quite close to grocery stores and mass transit is good and people can walk more and use mass transit more, there's an awful lot of that it frankly is kind of attractive to me, but it is also something that will take a long time to evolve toward in order to make the numbers. And so what I tend to spend my time and effort on is figuring out ways to make changes in the existing use of fuel with minimal changes to infrastructure. For example, one of the reasons I like drop-in fuels like butanol or diesel from algae is that they mix fine with existing fuels, and you don't even need separate fuel pumps at the gas station or whatever. And so I'm trying to figure out a way to get at oil without making any more infrastructure changes than are absolutely necessary. And then as time goes on, a lot more may be able to be done by things like improving mass transit and people deciding to some degree to change their lifestyles in order to be able to use mass transit and not have to have cars used as much as they are. But for a quick blow, which is what I'm focused on, you got to have, I think, minimal changes in the infrastructure and look for things that can be changed quickly. I was talking earlier today about a modification to existing internal combustion engines that's working out in the laboratory that would substantially improve their mileage and reduce their emissions and make them much more flexible with respect to what fuels they use. The interesting thing about that to me is that, at least as currently conceived, it does not require a new vehicle. You don't have to go into the cycle of development for Detroit or whatever is left of Detroit or even any other automobile company. You can take an existing vehicle and modify it. That would be something that could spread really fast. And so speed is what has focused me on some of these types of solutions I've suggested. You wanted one more?
Thanks very much for coming again. Appreciate it. I wish this was a class because I got like 5 questions I'd like to ask, but I'm going to stick with one. Over the last 10 years, it seems like it's becoming more and more apparent that we need to start solving the actual problem of energy and energy security instead of just treating the symptoms of the problem. And in that same vein, trying to solve the problem, one of the solutions that a lot of people have talked about, and I wanted to get your thoughts on it, is what about trying to take the money out of politics and political campaigns by doing federal public financing of campaigns? And I was wanting to get your thoughts on that concept?
Well, it's not a field I've gotten into very deeply because it affects an awful lot more than energy. It affects everything, the way our political system works. I tend to think a system that tries to channel the ways in which you can contribute to political campaigns is very difficult to manage. Sort of like a tax system, people are always able to find ways around it, and by redefining things and creating PACs and all of the stuff that happens. So I tend to think that either a complete and sole public financing of elections or a complete withdrawal of restrictions so anybody can say anything they want about anything would be, both of those would be at least rational ways to go. What is really hard, I think, is regulating in fine detail. If you organize this way, you can contribute. If you organize that way, you can't. It promotes a lot of dancing around and creating new institutions to get around the regulations and so on. But I freely admit this is not a subject I've studied thoroughly. And I think as long as any of us who have the views that are, to state it summarily, focused on moving away from oil and coal, as long as we're free to speak out and say what we think, my idea is let's get with it. And if we face more opposition because companies that have different interests are putting out a lot of more material, then we just have a bigger job and more material to refute. But I haven't ever gotten into the issue of how to affect energy by dealing with the reform of PACs or the like. It's kind of not the turf I've chosen to fight on.
Just for a second. Jim, we've been thrilled to host you here at UC Davis today, and you've accomplished an amazing feat with your remarks. This audience is extremely diverse, as you can tell. You have here people who are affiliated with the business school here at UC Davis. You have those who study political science and public policy, and you have scientists and engineers here in the audience here as well who are interested in technical issues, and you have managed to fascinate all of us and be relevant in your remarks. So terrific job with your thoughts, and thank you so much for that.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Just wanted to remind you that this event has been a partnership between the Graduate School of Management and our friends in the Institute for Governmental Affairs and Bob Huckfield, and the Energy Institute and Brian Jenkins. So we want to thank them for their involvement. And on behalf of them, Jim, I'd like to offer you a small token of our appreciation, a small gift. That is perhaps unsurprisingly a UC Davis object. So thank you again, Jim. It's been great to have you here. Just a reminder that today's presentation will be available for viewing online at the Graduate School of Management website, and will also air on University of California TV in the future. And we want to thank you again today for participating in this event. Thank you. Terrific. Thanks so much.